Welcome back to the Driveline R&D podcast. Jack Lambert here with Josh Heshka and Marek as usual. And we have a special guest here, Conner Pelletier, Driveline product engineer. Conner, you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, no, I'm just here working with Driveline in the R&D department. I've been here for about a year and a half now. I started as a sports science internship, dealing with what was our marketed mocap system at the time. Then I switched into more of a data science role, and then they kept me on as a product engineer, dealing with our systems and things like our in-app reports and stuff like that.
Yeah, and Conner is on the podcast today because he contributed to some pretty interesting research utilizing our intended zones tool. So what our intended zones tool is, just a very brief overview, essentially allows you to select your intention before you pitch a ball. So this allows us to actually quantify command. And Conner helped run this study that used that paired with our biomechanics lab, the Launchpad, to analyze what biomechanical traits are important in command. So really looking forward to kind of getting to deep dive into all that research and see what the next frontier of command is. Before we do that,
first official guest on the new pod.
Yeah,
That's right.
high bar.
It's an
You're
honor.
setting the
It's an
standard.
honor.
We'll see if it's a high bar.
Yeah, it's
You
good
set the
fine.
bar.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Heshka, from your perspective, what do you think is the main reason why command is so far behind velocity when it comes to like research and how we train it and how we quantify it?
I think the primary reason in my head is basically how easy it is to measure velocity, right? We've had jugs radar guns since the 70s and 80s, and maybe even before then. And it's really, really easy just to flash a number on the screen and, know how hard you're throwing. And I think at the root of Driveline is this concept of, test, retest, and quantifying your results. And it's really easy to do that when you can easily quantify the output that you're trying to chase, which is velocity. Command is much trickier because knowing where a pitcher throws his pitch isn't enough information to tell you how good that pitcher's command is, because it's also predicated on where the pitcher was trying to throw that pitch. In game especially, there's so many variables, and I know certain places such as Sports Info Solutions and what's the one we use? Inside Edge, yeah. So I know both of those places have done a lot of legwork in terms of quantifying the actual intended location, which just the fact that you have to have a team of people go through video and comb through it just to find out how good someone's command is tells you how different it is in velocity. But for me, that's the biggest reason why is that it's just not as quantifiable. And being able to quantify something is the first step towards training it and towards evaluating it. So in my mind, I think it's the lack of a true equivalent of a radar gun for command.
Yeah, I think all the objectives that are used commonly are like walk rate, zone rate, which are making assumptions that one, the guy doesn't, he wants to not walk this guy, doesn't want to walk him, and that he wants to throw the ball in the zone. So like in an 0-2 count, something like zone rate is going to reward curveball that's hung middle, and punish curveball buried in the dirt, even though pitcher likely tried to bury that pitch. So it's just hard publicly to get inside the pitcher's head and know exactly what they're thinking, which kind of leads us to one tool we built to combat this in the intended zones tracker. Conner, you want to give a rundown on what that is, what it entails?
Yeah, so that's just something we built in-house that basically pairs up to any TrackMan unit. We have a couple here in the Washington facility, and what it allows us to do is we can take a projector and any type of, projector mat that we can put where the strike zone would be. We can project a strike zone onto that mat and then pair it to the TrackMan so that you can set a target into that strike zone, throw the pitch, the TrackMan reads the pitch, reads the location of the pitch, and then that location is then relayed back into the projector and shown on that same strike zone relative to where your target was. And what's cool about this is that you can get just instant feedback on what your miss distance was for every given pitch. Whatever pitch type you throw, whatever location you chose to throw it to, you can see how much you missed by, and then once your TrackMan session's all over, we can wrap that all up and give you a report about it. But it serves as that radar gun equivalent that just lets you instantly quantify and get feedback on how much you missed by, both visually and numerically.
Yeah, I think something interesting just throughout this research, we were looking at different papers written or available on Google Scholar that referenced training throwing velocity, training throwing accuracy to kind of compare uh, how far we've gotten on velocity training as opposed to command training. And we found definitely not gospel, but we're at the point with command research that we were at in roughly 2004 with velocity research. And I think it's just this lack of radar gun to give you your objective of like, if I want to measure if I'm gaining velocity, that's easy.
Right.
I'm going to throw, I'm going to see where I'm at. I'm going to try this new lifting program. And then 6 weeks later, I'll
Right.
see if I gain velocity.
And it's worth noting that the study that we found that was closest to what we were trying to do when we first started to get going on this, they had to get what was a group of 5 people manually tracking the location of every pitch for the study. Um, Meanwhile, we were able to just do that instantly and automatically within our current setup of the launch pad. We have the IZT running on every mocap anyways, so we just kind of had guys come in there more often, and it's really all it took.
Yeah.
On the topic of in-game sources of this data, real quick,
Yeah.
I remember reading last season or maybe sometime recently that PitchCom, which can but doesn't have to specify an intended zone alongside the pitch type, maybe you would know, Hechka, was going to partner with someone and publish, the PitchCom data that therefore included intended zones somewhere. Is that still a thing, and is that mineable or useful for this kind of analysis?
As far as I know, I don't know if that's publicly available anywhere. I do think it's a little bit tricky sometimes too, because the pitches, like sometimes obviously spots aren't specified, but I do think there is a general use, right? So like if in an O2 count, if you tell a guy to throw a slider, there's a pretty good idea of where he's trying to throw that. Even if it's not a specific location, you kind of know the general zone or like the general area. So I think you could probably get pretty far with that. As far as I know, that's not actually publicly available or even privately available yet, but I could definitely see it going that way down the road.
But PitchCom does allow you to specify a location, but
Yeah,
that's just not always used. Okay.
How is that process? What does it look like when you have a catcher? If you have a guy that you throw to a bunch, is it just he's telling you a pitch type? If you haven't thrown to him a bunch, is he giving you pitch type and location? Like how often are you getting both those things?
So I think most pitches have a default, right? So if you hear four-seam fastball, that's the default is probably up. If you hear sinker, the default's probably down. If you're facing a same-handed batter, down and in. If you're hearing slider, it's down and away for most pitchers. Probably not for me, but so I think usually the default is the no location signal is your kind of quote unquote default location based on the situation of the count. And then, for example, if instead of in an O2 count, if I wanted to throw a backdoor slider instead of if I'm facing a lefty, I want to throw a backdoor slider instead of a back foot slider, you can specify slider away or four seam down. So it's usually quicker, obviously, just to go with the pitch type, but you can definitely specify location as well.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so that if that was public, it probably would help a little bit, but not be a huge boost on what we'd know from most pitches that are called. I guess you could, take the logical leap of if no location specified, assume they're aiming to the optimal run value or something.
Yeah, I know this is something you've talked about too, Lambo, and I don't know if you wanted to talk about it here, but I think a lot of times we assume a point estimate of a location, when in reality that's not exactly what's going through a pitcher's head. It's more so like throw it down and away, and kind of understanding where to miss and like what zone kind of to miss in, rather than aiming to a single location where all points equidistant are worth missing at. I know that's something you've talked about, and I think we're maybe building a metric on that at some point, but I don't know if you had any additional thoughts there.
Yeah, so it's tough because Inside Edge, they give us a zone similar to like the StatCast grid of 9, and then you have the 4 around the strike zone. So they give us something similar to that and identified that's the general area the pitcher was aiming for, which is the right way to do it because what you're saying is totally true. We take that to quantify a miss distance at MLB level. we just take the center of that zone and assume that those coordinates are the intended location. It's not perfect, but over the course of the season, like the inconsistencies kind of figure themselves out. It's nothing too off, and the numbers are consistent with what we see from our IZT in gym. The averages look very similar, and you still get guys like Trevor Williams dominating the leaderboards. And so, yeah, it's not perfect, but those are the assumptions we have to make. Just goes to show how difficult command is to quantify, because even when we have intention, we're still taking a logical leap on yeah.
I wonder if you could do distance from like the closest part of the zone that it missed also, like, and that's just me spitballing, but I wonder if you could like play around with different ways to quantify that.
So you could have a 0-inch miss distance within like 3 inches of the literal coordinate or something.
I don't know if that's the perfect idea, but I do think there's probably different things you could play around with. But it's exactly what you said. Like it's not like cut and dry. Like there's there's different things pitchers are trying to do with a pitch, and for example, also if I'm trying to throw a pitch low and away, I almost think I should be penalized more for throwing that pitch 6 inches towards the zone, or let's say it's an 0-2 count, a slider low and away. If I pitch that pitch 6 inches towards the zone, I should almost be penalized more than throwing 6 inches up or down below the zone. So up from my intended zone target, not above the zone. But yeah, I think there's like this nuance there.
Yeah, we did add a metric to combat that. So our execution grade is essentially, we talked about IPV, our intrinsic pitch value model. That's the component-based approach. So we run that IPV at the aim coordinates. So like we said, not ideal, but we run that there for a proxy, and then we run the actual IPV where the pitch ended up. And the delta between those two, that is your execution run value. So exactly what you're saying. On an 0-2 count, if you miss towards the zone, your execution is going to be way worse than if you missed away from the zone, and it's, oh, well, it was a little bit less likely to get a chase than I thought, but there's not a homer being hit off of it. Not that you'd ever give up a homer, but
that's impossible.
Yeah.
Please don't look up me in minor league spring training or major league spring training games. Just ignore that.
It was a tough day in athlete results. See Josh has 2 pitches. Second one, end of game.
That's actually how my concussion happened that I'm nursing right now, is the whiplash from watching that ball fly out of the park.
You gotta turn your head real quick to see that one get out.
I will say it was
not just
on the face.
Oh, sorry, you go.
No, sorry. That was a hell of an angle.
And also not just to use this podcast as a brainstorming session, but I think it also might be interesting from both a pitcher and a catcher grading perspective. Instead of just looking at intended location, but also looking at what their optimal location was in that situation, and saying how often are guys actually like even aiming in the correct spot. Maybe a guy's pretty good at hitting his spots, but he's either getting signaled the wrong location from his catcher, or he's choosing to throw in the wrong location. And so how much is he losing by just not even aiming in the correct spot in the first place?
Yeah, I wonder if to do that, would you do so we have a few different pitch value heat maps. We'll use one, just the intrinsic pitch value, the value of every pitch at every location. That's not ideal usually, because you need to account for the probabilistic nature of trying to throw a baseball, which is you're almost never going to hit it the exact coordinate that you're aiming for. So we can run a convolution over top of this with their misdistribution to determine where they should actually aim. Do you think it would be most valuable to run it with the raw heat map, or add in that misdistance to determine where they should be aiming?
It's a great question. I think both would be interesting to look at, because I think this kind of idea of misdistributions and knowing where to miss, I think is it's missed, quote unquote, like not pun intended, but it's missed by a lot of people, where at least in my experience, especially maybe lower level minor leagues, catchers tend to set up exactly where they want the pitch to end up without recognizing that there is this kind of probabilistic nature about where you aim a pitch, right? So the Phillies preach this kind of idea that's more prevalent now in Major League Baseball, which is more attacking the middle, especially early in counts, because of the probabilistic nature of where your pitches tend to miss. If you attack the middle, especially if your stuff's good enough, like your misses are going to be in the zone, and oftentimes they're going to be in the shadow, like the shadow part of the zone. They're going to be good pitches, just because of how often or how hard it is to basically hit your spot. Especially if you're trying to nitpick early in counts, half your misses are going to be outside the zone,
Yeah.
roughly. But
The
so I think it's not even like it hasn't even like reached a lot of people this idea that taking into consideration where you tend to miss is actually important too.
the middle location too is really interesting because our previous research on MLB data has shown that pitches tend to miss in the direction of their movement. So, like a four-seam fastball is going to miss up from its intended location. Your curveball is going to miss down. So when you set that middle target, you're kind of hedging your bets in the best way, which is give myself the most margin for error, and then also there's a decent chance this ends up above where middle actually is and will play up. So I think it is a really interesting strategy. I know guys like Glass made it very famous, and a lot of guys on the Rays are using it.
Do you guys tend to miss based on the pitch shape, or is it the arm angle? Right. So like if an overhand pitcher is throwing a sweeper, is his sweeper going to tend to miss glove side, or is his sweeper going to tend to miss up? Essentially,
That's
is my
a
question.
great question. Yeah, you'd have to control for arm angle due to the fact that like the lower you're only able to get vert on your slider because you're throwing submarine. Like a guy with 22
A
inches
hand of God sweeper, or like a hand of God slider overhand might have a different miss.
So
But
you'd have to
those are very correlated. Like most pitch shapes follow this kind of diagonal line that like your arm angle makes.
Yeah, we were just talking about that, the double helix of
Yeah.
what pitches you're able to throw just run across the arm angle. That'll be a pod for a different time on pitch design, but yeah, that'd be really interesting to look into. So
Sorry, I keep turning this into a Bebop's brainstorming session here.
hey, let the people hear. So getting into what Conner aimed to do with this study, do you want to run through what the goal was in the study and what it looked like from athlete perspective? What were athletes doing to collect data, and what were we analyzing?
Right. Yeah. So I'll start with saying that once I saw that we were putting the intended zones in the launch pad, this is exactly where my mind went. I was like, oh, I cannot wait to actually start to pair some of this data because this is just not something anyone else has access to or the ability to do, at least not at this scale, or anything close. So we were targeting just about anybody we could in gym for this study. We didn't have a true plan to start as far as analysis went. It sort of evolved as we got going. So we just tried to collect as much data as we could. We wanted a control for relatively high skill levels. We had college and affiliate pros mostly. And then we also wanted to control for intensity. So we had guys throwing on A days only, which is around 90% intensity. Still something relatively game-like where they're there and they're focusing on throwing hard and hitting their spot. Definitely still with enough intent where it's game-like. It's something in between a command session and a full velo session. We needed to separate it from our normal mocap process because it's standard for guys to come in here and do their normal, mocap assessment, and then they just throw as hard as they can. They really don't care where the ball's going, which is understandable. That's kind of what is just the norm for just that,
That setting, yeah.
specifically, to just sell out when you can. But realistically, in game, you're not doing that. So we wanted to try to emulate that as much as possible.
With the underlying goal mainly being let's see what we can find out from the biomechanical side
Yes. Yeah.
and how it translates to command.
Right. We have our existing biomechanics pipelines that capture just about everything you can imagine. We get all joint angles, positions, forces, angular velocities, translational velocities, energetics, all that stuff. We ended up limiting the scope of what we looked into a little bit just because there is so much. And with the sample size that we had, which ended up being about 25 to 30 guys with 10 pitches apiece.
Lowest level being ourselves.
Yes, that's true. That's true. We are the data set.
Created the data.
I did
Wait,
win.
I thought you said it was in high-level athletes.
Oh, yeah, exactly. We excluded ourselves from analysis. Don't worry. I had to cut it after 2 sessions. Conner and I were bet lunch on who could have the better miss distance.
Full lunch of buffalo.
Real quick, I was $35 down.
That's right.
A road to 85's coming soon, though.
Oh yeah,
Public doesn't know about that yet. They might.
Hey, we've
actually
been
know about
tweeting
that.
if they followed it diligently.
That's right. There'll be
Well,
more coming
85
too.
and 7-inch miss distances. Can't
Oh,
forget
There we
the
go.
hand podcast.
I will
Let's
say the
go.
hardest I threw was during that intended zones mocap.
Yeah,
I
Connor
still have not thrown harder than that.
Connor
So
peaked at it while he was trying to dot.
it's true. Maybe there's something to be said there, but
Velocity is command is velocity.
sure. Hey, maybe that's step 2.
So yeah, we collected all this data from these athletes that were in gym, high level, excluding ourselves, and then also in a phase ready to throw. So one of the things we did when we got this data, we kind of based our analysis originally off of a previous study that Connor mentioned, done in 2022. They also had a lab. They were looking at biomechanics to pitchers, and they had people manually charting where the pitches went up. And Connor, you want to run through what analysis they did and what we did?
Yeah, so they had a very similar setup to us where it was just all, a whole slew of biomechanical features, and they had a much larger sample than we did. I think they had like 110 professional athletes. So what they did is they just kind of narrowed down their scope of, included features and just threw them all into an ANOVA model or just an ANOVA analysis. Um, and saw that there was a good amount of variables that were significant across groups because that's what they did. They separated pitchers into high, medium, and low accuracy groups. They didn't do this on straight heuristics. They did more advanced, geometric modeling based on major and minor radii of the miss distance distribution for each guy, but I won't get too deep into that. Basically, what they saw was that forces at the elbow were lower in your higher command groups, which was pretty significant. Um, and that shoulder forces were also lower, and that your lead knee flexion was higher, meaning that your knee was more bent at foot plant. Um,
So, sorry to just jump in. The reason I'm a little skeptical of that study, and I don't know if you were going to touch on this, Connor, but I'm a little skeptical of this existing research, and I know that they separated into different groups, and I think the study even mentioned that the groups had the same average velocity.
they did, yes.
But it was much for professional athletes. I think the average velo that they had was somewhere in the low 80s, if I'm not mistaken. So it was much lower intent days. But I think the reason I'm skeptical is because they basically, the three things that you just mentioned were all are probably the three things that I would mention as inverse correlates to velocity. And so it makes me think there's a little bias there in the sense that if a pitcher is a professional pitcher, which I believe is what you said the population was, they either have to be good at they either have to throw hard or they have to have good command to be a professional pitcher. And so if you don't throw hard, you basically necessarily have good command. And so what they basically found is that the professional pitchers who don't throw hard, which is the three correlates that we're talking about, bad knee, bad front knee, lower elbow forces, lower shoulder forces, that those guys have good command. But that's pretty much I feel like that's a pretty solid example of selection bias. I think it's so that it makes me a little bit skeptical. I'll let you continue, but I just wanted to mention that.
No, that's valid. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't have similar suspicions, but their data did show exactly the same average velocities across groups, which was said a lot. And then, I mean, it was the group selection analysis also seemed pretty solid from what I could tell. So realistically, their methods seem pretty sound. So. I don't remember exactly what the average velocities were across each group. I do remember them being around 90, which they did just say professional pitchers, so that could be reasonable. I'm not sure. They didn't say what level really. But no, either way, it seemed like, I was surprised this hadn't caused more ripples, this seems like a big deal to me where it's even if their selection, we can assume that there was no selection bias, right? And that these were novel, very novel findings that would push it forward. It's this seems like something you'd want to build on, where it's hey, you want to lower your risk of injury.
Yeah.
You
can have better command when you do it. Yeah.
Right.
Because
that's what you should be trying to do here, not just chasing velocity. It's it's the counteract to chasing velocity, right? Training command at the same time,
and that's something we touched on we presented this at Sabre Analytics conference, and one of the slides we had was a grid of stuff and command run for Ben Joyce, Yu Darvish, and Kyle Hendricks. So fastest fastball, average fastball, slowest fastball, and what their pitch value heat maps would look like if they had elite, average, or bad command, basically demonstrating that if you're Kyle Hendricks, you need to be able to dot. And if you're Ben Joyce, you can have wild command. And if you're Yu Darvish, you may be able to get away with average command, but the better command you have, the better your results are going to be. So yeah, it just that trade-off is one that 100% exists, and I think is under. I don't think it's talked about as much as it should be, just because we don't really have a good idea publicly of like what good command is. How do you train it? How do you do all that?
Right. All right. I believe wasn't your example like if you're using, most publicly available methods are like in zone rate and
Yep,
stuff
exactly.
like that.
Yeah, the metrics we talked about
Yeah,
earlier.
in zone rate is great unless you're trying to bury an 0-2 curveball, and then it's going to punish you even if you perfectly execute your pitch.
Yeah.
So stuff like that. It just doesn't really grasp what we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, so building on that previous research, we attempted ANOVA analysis. Ultimately, didn't have the sample to find anything significant. So we pivoted to addressing some preconceived notions about command. The main one being that repeatable mechanics make for repeatable pitch location, aka good command. Connor, you want to dive into the original analysis and what we found there?
Yeah. So like you said, we just wanted to, if you've played baseball before, you've probably heard a coach talk about, a guy having repeatable command or repeatable mechanics, meaning he has good command and vice versa. And that's something that you should, aim for as a pitcher is to have repeatable mechanics. So we just decided to look at variance or standard deviation, more accurately, of all of the biomechanical features we looked at. Specifically, we were looking at our joint positions and our joint angles at 4 key points in the delivery. The 4 key points being peak knee height, foot plant, max external rotation, and ball release. So we just took everything we had outside of your ankle angles and positions there, which we didn't think were too important there, and we added a couple other engineered features like stride direction, stride length, things like that. Um, and so we just took the standard deviation of all of these features for each of the athletes, and we compared them to the average miss distance for each of these athletes. So we'd end up getting what was at the end, I think, 27 data points that we could just find correlations for these average miss distances to the standard deviation or the variance of any of these biomechanical features.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that we did find some things need to be repeatable throughout the delivery.
Yeah.
Specifically, we have glove shoulder abduction at foot plant. So you can think of this as you're flying open
Right.
traditionally, what coaches would say. The standard deviation there was significant in correlating to miss distance, where the more variable you are in that position at foot plant, the higher miss distance we saw. And then also the torso lateral tilt at foot plant, which essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, is determining the axis you're rotating around from foot plant on.
Pretty much.
So it would make sense you're going around a different plane.
Right.
It's going to be harder to command the ball.
Yeah, you're keeping all else the same, your arm action is going to be different, your arm angle is going to be different, and then your release point is going to be different, which likely means you're going to have a different, ending.
Bunch of downstream effects from a small positional change.
Did y'all look at misdirection at all? Because, the flying open convention lends itself to missing up, at least in Little League speak. Is that in the data set or something you looked at?
That was not within our scope, but that is something we could do. We do have the actual and intended location with intended zones, and that is something we talked about trying to get going in subsequent analysis. But for what we're talking about here, we weren't able to look into that.
I think that is definitely we'll get into next steps later, but stuff like that is likely the next frontier of like, okay, which specific positions do we need to get into to limit this specific type of miss?
Right. We kept things pretty general for this analysis, but that is the exciting new frontier of this, is that we can start to get into the nitty-gritty, the more specifics pretty soon here.
Yeah.
So was it all that lower? So you mentioned at foot plant those metrics, lower variance meant better command.
No,
that the case for?
Well, that's a good transition into the other findings we found were so those two things: glove shoulder abduction at foot plant and torso lateral tilt. Higher variance is worse. You need to be repeatable there. What we weren't expecting there were a ton of features that lower or higher variance meant better command.
right.
Which, what conclusion did that lead you to, Connor?
That immediately suggested to me that, adjustability is as important, if not more important than
Yeah.
repeatability. It's the ability to adjust from these downstream effects we talked about earlier for like if you might have a different torso lateral tilt at foot plant, can you do what you need to adjust the rest of your delivery so the ball is going to the same spot? And this made sense. There's that famous study of Bernstein's hammer where
Yeah.
they looked at all the blacksmiths and the most elite blacksmiths in terms of the consistency of where they were striking the blade had the most variance in their swinging motion. So intuitively, this made sense, but obviously, this wasn't some rhetoric that we were seeing commonly in baseball. So we kind of wanted to dig in a little more. We also weren't seeing much of a clear pattern in what needed to be repeatable
Yeah.
and why. So there was clearly some more analysis to be done, and I'll let you get into that.
Yeah, so that I think the Bernstein's hammer example is a good intro in that if we break this down into the swing of the hammer and the result needs to be the same every time. We want minimal variance there.
Right.
And to get there, we want to maximize variance. So sort of stuff's going to go wrong when we're swinging the hammer.
Right.
You're a human. But by the end of it, you need to have adjusted accordingly so the end result is the same.
Yes.
So we phrase this, or I guess first we'll look at the different connections we used in connecting repeatability and adjustability conceptually, like in order. Do you want to explain high level what this calculation or equation was?
So basically, once we tried to see if we couldn't, connect these ideas of adjustability and repeatability into one metric that described, and we were able to find correlations to miss distance with. But when you're trying to get both of these at the same time, you basically need to compare two features, or at least two different points in time. So now order starts to matter, right? When you're looking at your elbow flexion at max external rotation, and then finding, comparing that to what happens afterwards makes sense. You don't want to compare that to something that happened before.
Yep. Yeah. So we took ratios of these.
Yes, exactly. We took these same standard deviations,
and we compared things that happened at the next key point in time. So our key points in time being peak knee height, foot plant, max external rotation, ball release.
Yep.
So only looking one to the next.
Right.
Then we're also comparing anything at or above it in the kinetic chain.
Exactly.
Correct? So knee metrics would be compared to, so knee metrics at peak knee height would also be compared to knee metrics at foot plant, but also hip metrics at foot plant and torso metrics at foot plant, going over everything up the kinetic chain.
Right.
And then everything one sequence in advance in time.
Right. We're trying to just capture the relationship of this causal effect where you see these downstream effects happening, where you see positions and movements at one part of the throw affect how things are happening later on in the throw. And it was important that you had a temporal aspect to this order, obviously, but that it also went up the kinetic chain as the energy's flowing up the chain and into ball release. It was important to capture, how all of this was happening in time, realistically.
Yeah. So this allowed us to break the throw into three components. You have your peak knee height to foot plant, your foot plant to max external rotation, then your max external rotation of ball release.
Right.
And essentially looking at metrics, one metric at peak knee height, one metric at foot plant. We were able to find some pretty meaningful results in where you want to be variable, where you want to be consistent.
Yeah. So this also ended up in us breaking up these adjustability metrics, we'll call them, into two key categories.
Yeah.
One where you funnel in, you start your initial starting point is a higher variance state, and then you funnel into a lower variance state, right? Where you see a higher number here means that you are starting with a higher number in the numerator here. You have a higher standard deviation to start with, and then you have a lower number in the denominator. You have lower variance to end with. So this is what we called a funnel in metric, as in you're funneling in this high variance to low variance. And then you have the opposite as well. You have funnel out. You start from a low variance point, the same starting point, you can think of it, and then you have different exit patterns to get to whatever you are need to do throughout the throw to deliver the ball correctly.
And it was hard for me to wrap my head around these at the beginning. I think the funnel in made sense to me. You are adjustable to get to a repeatable
Right,
spin.
that's Bernstein's hammer.
Yes.
Is funnel in.
And then funnel out took a while for me to wrap my head around, but I started thinking it more as so we have the throw in three components: peak, knee height, to foot plant. If I were to have a funnel out at that point, it would be saying this specific biomechanical feature at foot plant needs to be your cleanup point for everything that went wrong previously.
Exactly.
Just because you're a human, throwing a baseball is one of the most violent things your body can do.
Yeah, it's never
Everything's
gonna happen
happening
the
so
same.
fast.
Yeah.
You're never going to be perfectly repeatable.
Right.
You need to clean up all the stuff that happened differently in this specific segment.
Right.
As your sort of funnel out.
Yes, exactly.
So looking at peak knee height to foot plant, I won't go into all the specific metrics we found here, but Conner, do you want to run through the overarching themes we saw and what needs to be variable, what needs to be consistent?
Yeah, so we noticed that at peak knee height, well, we noticed first of all that all of these variables that were significant representing the transition from peak knee height to foot plant were funnel in features, suggesting that you needed to have a higher variance, or not needed to, but that having a higher variance during peak knee height and then funneling that into a lower variance at foot plant was better for command. Specifically, we saw that the variables that needed to have low variance at foot plant were what we called flip up variables that had to do, it was your throwing shoulder abduction and internal rotation.
Yep.
So basically everything having to do with where this arm is in space in terms of it flipping up after foot plant. Because that's when the flip up occurs, is directly after foot plant. As rotation, starts with the pelvis and goes up the chain, the arm flips up, but it's basically this trigger point of where your arm is at the beginning of this rotational sequence. That should be consistent, is what they suggested.
The important point here too, tying that together, is that we found that the velocities of essentially your torso, your center of mass at peak knee height needed to be variable to get to that point.
Right, where it's like, the way I took it is that it doesn't matter how you move during your leg lift, your drift, your coil, all of these things that involve the pelvis and the torso at peak knee height. All that matters is that you can move from these states, however variant they are, and then get to a consistent spot with your flip up position.
Yeah, just as a question, just in the interest of being accurate and precise here, is so from what I'm understanding, what matters is basically getting to consistent positions at at foot plant with these particular metrics that we're talking about. Is it more so that you need to be variant, or is it more so that it's allowable for you to be variant as long as you can get to that same position? Is it in my head, it seems more intuitive that it'd be like it's like allowable and not necessarily required, but I didn't know if that's something that you guys looked at or found a different distinction between.
I'd say allowable is definitely a better word to put to it. I would definitely hesitate to say you need to be more variant, but we did kind of try to isolate these positions at foot plant and see how important they were on their own. They, first of all, on average, your average internal rotation and your average shoulder abduction doesn't matter for missed distance at all.
Correlation of 0.07 and negative 0.1.
Yeah. So
your average in between population, you're saying, or like within yourself, like the variance within yourself?
The average within yourself. So again,
like the actual level of these things is not indicative of command.
Okay. Or it's like, it's not saying that you need to have a certain level of shoulder abduction every time. That's obviously unique pitcher to pitcher. The variances did matter. Just the standard deviations alone had a stronger correlation. There was a relationship there between having a more consistent shoulder abduction, shoulder and turn rotation. More
Mhm.
consistent flip up positions meant having better command. But when we did put them in the context of your peak knee height positions and those, torso positions during the coil and the leg lift, all of a sudden those relationships got a lot stronger,
Yeah.
which we thought was some pretty interesting signal and something that
That is interesting.
So yeah, you are right though. It could be not a necessity, but an observation
I
of
think it's
the
some-
guys who got to consistent positions also were variable in their peak knee height. You could make the leap to say because they were variable to get themselves to the same positions.
right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think what's interesting about that is I think kind of in this Bernstein's hammer lens, and I think part of the reason this Bernstein's hammer phenomenon happens and like why this happens in skill is that the environment that you swing the hammer once is not the exact same environment that you swing the hammer the next time. Same thing with you throw a pitch, right? Like you're slightly more fatigued. Like maybe your heart rate's a little bit higher. The mound is now a little bit deeper because you dug a little bit of a hole when you made the throw, right? So like all these micro things in the environment that are changing, like those are variables you can't control. And I guess it really is intuitive to me that the guys that are able to funnel into the especially these metrics at foot plant, even though there's all this variability that's happening before then. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm interested to hear about this funnel out as well because I think
No,
that's a
yeah,
little
I
bit less
think-
intuitive.
I think you touched on exactly what we're trying to get at here is that I think that putting these flip up positions at foot plant in the context of your peak knee height positions and seeing these correlations get stronger basically says that these people who can deal with these high variances and still get into specific positions suggests that they are adjustable overall and that
Essentially
because of this-
athletic.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. They have
They're
exactly.
athletes.
No, it's a great point.
They
That's a great point.
self-organized in better ways to allow themselves to achieve this external goal they're focusing on.
Yeah. So that
I do think that's similar to like when you see the guys who do the crazy leg lifts and stuff like that in the MLB as well. Those tend to be your high command guys, and it's not necessarily
that's a
that
good
you have
point.
high command because you're doing those crazy leg lifts. It's you feel comfortable doing those crazy leg lifts because you have high command.
Right.
I think it's like there's a little bit of a nuance there, and I think that could be applicable here a little bit as well.
I'll plug him on every podcast. Yeah.
Too.
So that was the main funnel in feature we found. The other two, we found some key stuff from foot plant to max external rotation, then to ball release. These were both funnel out,
Yes.
which, like you, Heshka, I was a little skeptical of at first, but started thinking about it more. Once your foot hits the ground, like we talk about the throw as a violent motion.
Yes.
That's the violence.
Yes.
Like this is all happening so quick. You're rotating so quick. Energy's being shot up through your body, through your arms.
Especially at the higher levels, it's like it's only
Yeah.
it's only quicker. It's only
A split second.
Right.
So yeah, we at foot plant to max external rotation. Yeah, Connor, you want to dive into the specifics there?
Yeah. So we saw that, like you said, for foot plant to max external rotation and max external rotation to ball release, all of the features that we saw with significantly high correlations to miss distance were funnel out, meaning that you started from your low variance point and with different exit patterns as you go throughout the throw. For foot plant to max external rotation specifically, it was torso positioning that was important at foot plant to have low variance, more consistency. And then scap retraction was the only feature that consistently showed up in terms of having high variance, where this is where you want to have more variance at max external rotation specifically.
The place you can clean up your inconsistencies
Yes.
at max external rotation is your scap retraction,
Right.
essentially.
Yes. And that makes a lot of sense too, because if you think about it just in the, chronology of the throw, as you get into max external rotation is usually around when you're getting your max scap retraction. You're getting peak layback, you're getting the most pull on that pec as you probably can. So that is basically the last thing to happen before max external rotation is this scap retraction. So it makes sense that as you get into max external rotation, how much you get into scap retraction determines how you move on and then proceed to correct yourself is really what it is. This is the correction point, the cleanup point before you move on to the next point of throw. When you start to actually arm rotates inward, you get into the driveline phase, which we'll be talking a little bit about later. and then you deliver the ball.
Yeah. So then from max external to ball release, what do we find there?
Similar things where it was these were funnel out features again. So you started from a lower variance point here specifically in your upper body kinematics. The way your upper body was moving, whether that be your your glove arm or your torso, um, these were supposed to be more consistent in what we saw, and that your rate of pronation into ball release, not
Mhm.
the actual pronation angle itself, but this rate of pronation into ball release is what needed to be variable.
Yeah.
This was similar to scap retraction. This was your cleanup point. This is the last thing to happen in this phase from max external rotation to ball release.
And also makes sense. This is the last thing that happens.
Exactly.
Like
In the
it's
throw.
ball release and your forearm here. Like
Right.
this is the only place we can make any adjustments at this point.
Right.
So it makes sense that those adjustments are higher for the guys that command the ball better.
Right. And I think this made a lot of sense when putting it in the perspective of the driveline phase of the throw, which was
Mhm.
something that one of the pitching trainers here actually opened us up to, was that this is what Mike Marshall coined as
Yeah.
this phase from peak layback into ball release, basically,
Mhm.
where you see the arm start to spiral out, and then as it starts to maintain a straight line towards the target is what this driveline phase is, and is
Mhm.
what driveline was named after. And it's where the length of this phase could be different on any given throw. You know, if you were to happen to fly open more than you would on a throw, you're probably not going to maintain this, linear momentum of your wrist towards the target for as long as you might if you were to follow through towards your target perfectly every time, right? But being able to pronate quicker to get to the same point of release regardless of what might have happened earlier, specifically like here with flying open,
Mhm.
seemed to suggest that you had higher command, which made sense to us.
That's really fascinating. I think it does make a little bit more sense intuitively. I do think it makes sense as like everything else that's quote unquote like variable about your throw. That's kind of where like leading into the funnel in, that's where you get consistent to the like a certain position and where you can rotate violently. And then the variants that you see in these funnel out metrics are basically, I think as you guys explained, are the times where skillful athletes can basically adjust the timing that there may be like that may be slightly off from other variables that are happening as well. So like the body can make these micro adjustments in the scap retraction, micro adjustments in how the rate of pronation is happening to make sure that the goal is still being attained, which I think is super fascinating. It does make a little bit more intuitive sense.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I did not expect to come out of this and my main takeaway be that this is something that is probably most effectively trained on the HP side of things.
Right.
But yeah, Heshka, I'm interested in your thoughts as a player, and Marek, yours too, having some coaching experience as well. And to me, it seems like this is something where a constraints-led approach would be very effective.
Yeah, so my mind immediately goes to constraints-led approach, dynamical systems. I think there's a lot that we can do where we basically, instead of trying to, and I think one of the downsides of this kind of common trope about repeatable mechanics is that it makes everyone believe that there's one right way of doing this, when it's very clear that that's not right. The key is that in a lot of what we're gathering from this is adjustability and being able to figure out how to complete the task that you're trying to complete, even if things are different, the environment is slightly different, the body condition is slightly different. And I think one of the dangers of this kind of like repeatability idea is that if you just do the same thing over and over and over again, you'll learn how to like do repeatable mechanics. And that's just simply not true. And that's the constraints-led approach, I think, is very important. But I also think my mind immediately goes to who's the best thrower on a baseball field. And it's usually not the pitcher. It's a shortstop.
Yep.
The shortstop can throw from various angles, various positions, and he hits the first baseman every time. And I think that's exactly why you see a lot of success converting position players to becoming pitchers, is because these position players have such a nuanced like not nuanced implies conscious. Like it's such a, they're so skillful at the act of throwing. They're great throwers. They can basically they throw in any way, different arm slots, different body positions, right? And they can still complete a throw successfully. I think training better throwers, more athletic throwers, is one of the solutions here. And I'm excited to kind of see how we apply this on the training side. But I think getting away from this idea that there's one right way of doing it, there's one perfect set of mechanics that you should be throwing with. That's a very dangerous idea, not necessarily dangerous in the sense of potentially getting hurt, but dangerous in the sense that it's going to prevent people from reaching their full potential as throwers, because you're being put into this box of implying that you can do the same thing every time. It's just not possible. It's just not possible with everything we know about how environments change and how the body moves.
Right.
Yeah, Marek, am I right? Was Schwellenbach a former shortstop?
That's exactly where my mind went. Yeah, no, now we have a reason why it works out for him. So
Yeah, I think DeGrom was too, and he's the epitome
Yep.
of throw the ball 100 and also have like top 10 miss distance in the league. It's just this is unfair.
That's where I think it comes back to. There's obviously it's more recognized in in velocity, than command.
Yeah.
The idea that your best throwers, your hardest throwers, are the ones that just self-organize the best. You know, they can take advantage of the way their body moves better than other people can. Right?
Yeah.
Whether that be just taking advantage of some freakish mobility they might have in certain phases of the throw, or just whether that be being able to take advantage of their fatigue and, self-organize with everything they have to work with. Just they have elite proprioception is basically what I'm trying to get at. They can command themselves. They're just better athletes.
Yeah.
Basically.
Well, it's the Connor White, our director of HP, was talking about the example of elite jumpers when they're fatigued. I'll butcher the exact the exact metrics, but it was essentially there's no drop off in how high they can jump. They just do it in a different way.
Right.
They just get it done, which seems to be similar to our findings here,
Right.
Which would backed up also by Bernstein's hammer. And I think it's a really fascinating study, and I'm extremely interested to get this rolling.
Something else that I think this brings to mind, though, is in order to be able to self-organize to complete a task, it's important that you have the correct task. If you're never training with a target, if you're never training to like throw with command, you won't have better command because your body's self-organizing to a different goal. Like, this is why it's extremely important to know what you're training and why. If your goal is training velocity, it's okay to not have a target because you're trying to increase the max output. You can't throw 95 for a strike if you can't throw 95. So being able to build the skill first and then apply it later into a game setting is good. But with command, if you're and I'm going to sound like an old school coach here, but you have so many like, let's say I'm throwing 7 days a week, 80 throws a day. I'm throwing 500, 600 throws a week. If the vast majority of those throws, and let's say that I'm a guy who needs to work on command. If the vast majority of those throws are just kind of lollygagging, maybe I'm throwing too many plyos actually, because plyos are an example of something where maybe we're inward focused rather than outward focused task. If you're a guy who needs to work on command, you need to think about the allocation of throws you have in a week and how you're going to apply them to like get better at the skill you need to get better at. And for guys who need to get better at command, like it's pretty simple. Like, you need to be throwing to a target. Like, you need to be throwing with a purpose that's outside of your personal mechanics and outside of the velocity that you're trying to throw with. If you're a guy that needs to throw harder, then go ahead. Don't throw to a target. Try to throw as hard as you can. That's fine as well. But being intentional about the goal you're trying to accomplish in your throwing program, you have so many throws in a week, but we're not like hitters. We can't throw a million times a week like hitters can swing a million times a week. So being very intentional about the allocation of workload that you do have. And if you're working on command, throw to a target, long story short. Like, actually work on the skill you're trying to develop.
Right. Yeah, it makes the IZT so exciting because it's gamifying this. You have a target, and now every pitch you're getting feedback immediately. It's the same as seeing the radar gun pop up. You can see, I missed 12 inches on that, 14 on that, 6 on that. It's just totally gamifying it. You find out.
Feedback loop is so huge.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Yeah,
I'm glad you brought up external or this external focus too, because I think that's the big part of it, right? Where it's like command. there's obviously an external goal here, and you need to have this focus on that goal to achieve what you're doing. Like if you were a player or a coach and you're going to try to implement the findings we went over earlier, chances are you're just going to be worse as a player. You know,
One way
like,
ticket to Yip City.
exactly. That was one of
Yes.
our hitting trainers came in. We're talking about the stuff in the office. We're trying to figure out, how exactly what these numbers mean. You're just cavemen around a campfire. You're trying to figure out what to do with the fire. But a hitting trainer comes over as we're talking to some pitching trainers, and he just starts laughing. He's like, "Man,
Never going to throw a strike
yeah,
again.
you guys are never gonna throw a strike again. You guys are done." But
But I think that's a crucial piece. We're not teaching guys, hey, like have more variability in your pronation, your rate of pronation.
And that's where there's going to be nuance in this constraint, right? Where it's like, okay, we see these things are important for command now, but how do we actually train this in a way that's not going to just yip up our athlete? How do we?
It's the same thing with
actually
velocity. We
expect-
don't tell guys like, hey, extend your knee faster.
Right,
It's like
no,
we
exactly.
train velocity in a separate setting, and then we realize that that's a signal that velocity is increasing.
And that's also what's exciting about this is that we're still seeing these correlates to velocity and how velocity training has just become completely streamlined in that way, where there are go-to drills and cues and things like that. But there's just nothing like that in command other than focus. Just throw more and try to throw more strikes is really like the extent of command training right now, right? We do here have the command balls, which I think are really interesting, and I think
Yeah.
the closest thing we have to a constraint that is going to drive us in this direction of, forcing the adaptations that we saw necessary here with our findings. But they're basically just leather baseballs that are lighter than baseballs and weighted differently. The idea is that you just kind of
Some of
close
them are
your
also
eyes.
heavier.
Oh, that's true. Right.
So does total variability
Right,
in
just-
what you're throwing.
Right. You just have a bucket full of a bunch of random ones. You close your eyes, pick one up, try to throw a strike with it. It does make sense. Like within the lens of our study, this is going to probably force different patterns of scap retraction and rate of pronation, but still require you to get into similar positions at foot plant to like just throw the ball in general.
Yeah.
Right.
It was reassuring that, our findings supported what we had done more or less on a hunch previously
Right.
of the command balls are likely good, creating these adaptations, getting you to adjust in order to get the same repeatable solution. And then I know a lot of our throwing in the gym, we focus on when you have your 30 throws, don't just throw into a net. Like throw on the run, get
Right.
in weird positions and throw. Like all this stuff also helps with command, even though we're in a velocity training phase.
Right.
So reassuring from knowing that we weren't totally off on our on our previous.
It just comes back to just being better at throwing. To apply throwing to pitching in a better way, you need to be a better thrower. So whether that's different, learning how to command these different. If you can throw like these different, slightly 5% bigger balls, 5% smaller balls, 5 ounce or ounce heavier, ounce lighter, and you can throw all those for a strike, it's gonna be really easy when the ball isn't changing every pitch. Same thing with like. There's a reason I like long toss for command development. Because if you can hit a guy in the chest from 300 feet away, it's much easier to hit a guy in the chest from 60 feet away.
Do you long toss sidearm or do you
Overhand. I go sidearm out to like 90, 120, and then the ball just goes like straight to the ground. So I have to switch it up a little bit.
Sounds like an athletic thrower right there.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Do you have good command?
Command, I think, is probably it'd probably be my highest scouting grade if I had to guess.
And do you think a lot of it is throwing weird and having to you probably throw from more angles through the course of a day than 99% of pro athletes?
It's definitely possible. I don't want to like n=1 myself, but I do think max long toss and like learning how to self-organize to get a ball where you want it to go 300 feet away helped me a lot. I don't know if there's like research that backs that up, but from my intuition, I feel like it kind of fits within this framework we're talking about here.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems to align with what we thought. Yeah, n=1.
I do have one more question about what you guys looked into. Did you guys find any importance to the actual release point that a guy was throwing with? Is there like more variance, less variance? No relationship with the previous variables. Like, did you guys find anything with the actual release point itself?
I believe that standard deviation was also in the initial set, and I don't think it
wasn't significant.
I don't think so. No.
Interesting.
Again,
So it's
we're a
less so
little
about
bit
the release point
analysis.
itself.
Right.
Well,
It's about just like adjusting to get to the
yeah.
release point that's best for
So
your mechanics that pitch.
it's worth
Yes.
noting though that so all the like angles measurements we talked about are all relative to the body, relative
Right.
to specific points on the body. The release point's going to be in the global coordinate system. So
Yeah.
there's probably going to be a lot of noise if a guy lines up 4 inches different on the rubber this time.
Right.
Just
That's a great point. Great point.
we may be subject to some noise there. I know the closest thing I can think to in public research that I've seen on this is I think Michael Rosen did a piece on release angles and release angle windows. It might have been Max Bay. I don't want to
Yeah.
miscredit, or I think both of them have done stuff with it. So credit to both of them. But consistency of release angle they found was a decent proxy for command, which I think makes sense in almost like the other side of the flex or the rate of pronation.
Yeah.
Get to the right rate of pronation to get the same release angle. Get
Exactly.
another funnel in metric, same release angle, different rates to get there.
Right.
Depending on where you're at.
Right. Because I
That's
think
super fascinating.
that is kind of the ultimate end of this, pattern from funnel in to funnel out to funnel out, is that obviously you still want low variance in the end result, which is
Yeah.
the pitch location. So really the last step from ball release to pitch location needs to be funnel in.
Yeah, which would be the literal release of
Right.
the ball.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this is interesting as well, because I think this fits in with something. I think we might have mentioned this on a previous podcast, but I believe there was some study where they measured guys who were fatigued, whether it was bad night of sleep or just generally fatigued. And I believe they found that command gets diminished before velocity does. In a lot of ways, velocity is just like force generation. But like understanding these nuances of command, it blows my mind. And it's like, number one, it blows my mind that it's even possible to like consistently throw strikes. With all these like little nuances of like where you have to, and like a very small change in your hand position could lead to a very, very drastic difference in ball position. So it's super fascinating, and it makes a lot of sense, all this neurological coordination that needs to happen to be able to throw strikes, and why being fatigued might affect that first. I think that it helps that click in my head as well.
Right. I think that brings up what you said Connor White was talking about, where
Yeah.
it's like jumpers are similar, where it's like they're going to jump in different ways.
The elite ones.
The
Yeah.
elite ones. They'll do it in different ways, but they'll still have the same end result, which I think is what you see in velocity, where, like you said, it's force generation, where it's something that they're going to be able to compensate better given fatigue, especially the elite ones, just because they have this elite proprioception. But command is obviously
It's probably
There's no
similar
command
for
in
the elite
jumping.
guys, but yeah, it's
compensate in better ways. I think this is where you can start to see where these funnel out variables, even what we talked about from max external rotation to ball release, you still wanted to start from a relatively low variant starting point, right?
Mhm.
And I think this is almost indicative of you don't want to have there be so much variance going from foot plant to ball release that you cannot make the necessary adjustment.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
These adjustments that are made with this variability at scap retraction and at rate of pronation at ball release, that variability needs to still compensate for what's going on. And if there's too much variance that happened beforehand, there simply just isn't enough range of motion or mobility to compensate correctly sometimes. And I think that's what you'll see when guys get fatigued, is that it's just these starting points that should be low variance are higher variant, and then they just
It'd be
can't
really
compensate.
interesting to look into. Yeah. I think what you're saying makes sense, but I'd love to dive
Right,
into
yeah.
data on it.
Yeah,
And
this is just all theoretical and hypothetical, but
guess we'll have to hop back on the mound for a 100 pitch
that's
A-reg
right.
session.
That's right. And that is
We've got
the thing.
one.
We got
Yeah, well, Marek?
No, just one observation about a part of the analysis that y'all didn't touch on. That I know I'm hard pivoting here, but
Yeah.
you did a PCA here and found that 10 PCs only accounted for 80% of the variance
yeah.
in your feature set.
Yeah.
That suggests to me that there are a lot of, a wide array of compositions of the sort of metrics that you're looking at that that capture, how the population throws and fits into these buckets. And even across 10 PCs, you're not getting nearly the amount of explained variance that you would typically get. Any insights
Yeah.
on
Right.
that particular
That
aspect?
was almost encouraging to us, I think. At least to me, when I saw that you can't necessarily just decompose these features into, three or four key components is like,
Mhm.
oh, that okay, there is value in each of these on their own or most of them on their own. You can group them together to get more, but realistically there's so much variance between guys here that we have a decent representative of a variant population is what that
Yeah.
said to me.
We also so all these metrics are very specific, and when we talk through this, like at peak knee height, we're basically saying your pelvis and torso, just combine those, need to move or not need to, generally move differently to get to a same position at foot plant in your shoulder, your flip up.
Right.
So we're using these blanket terms. Specifically here, that's referring to pelvis lateral tilt, pelvis anterior tilt, pelvis anterior tilt angle, velocity, pelvis anterior
Yeah.
tilt angle. It's a bunch of different metrics where we can kind of see the forest through the trees and be like, okay,
Yes, exactly.
something with the way your pelvis and torso are moving is variable, and that is a good thing.
No, that's
I'm
true.
gonna quit talking about pelvis and torso because I clearly can't say it.
But no, you're right. Where it's we that's the only way we can really make this digestible, much less actionable, is if
Yeah.
we can tie these directly to events that are happening in the throw and positions that people are, comfortable and know a decent amount already. It's
Mhm.
like scap retraction and max external rotation. Like, obviously that makes sense. That's why we also refer to, upper body kinematics as upper body kinematics.
Yeah.
Where it's like realistically, that was from max external to ball release.
Yeah.
That's about all that's happening from max external to ball release is upper body kinematics. Like that's just everything you're gonna see happening for the most part. Um, but we didn't want to start naming whatever it was, glove shoulder horizontal abduction
Yep.
and torso, X angular velocity, yeah. So
Sweet. Yeah. We got anything else, fellas? All right. Good stuff. We'll see you
Yeah,
next
I
week.
think.
Oh,
Yeah, I just
sorry.
wanted to say I think this is super fascinating. I think this is like the first command research that I'm actually like. I think this is like the most novel command research I've come across, and I'm not just hyping you guys up because I know you, but this is really awesome.
yeah, no, it's
Award winning.
That's right. That's right. One of what might have been a
Sample of
two-person
two, yeah.
competition. Yeah. But no, yeah. Shout out to
Flex the
everyone.
hardware a little bit.
That was an honor to get that award.
Edit that part out. Don't tell the people there were only two people running for this award. Yeah.
Fix it in post.
Yeah.
But no, I will say before we go our separate ways, there is a very like this does open the door to more research too that
Mhm.
we can do here, especially as the college summer's coming around. We're probably going to get a lot more athletes here because
Mhm.
this is one of the well-known dead periods of any training facility while everybody's in season. So getting people back here, being able to mocap them, and being able to just kind of evolve our analysis to higher sample sizes, to larger scopes,
Yep.
to different forms of analysis because of those things.
Like Marek was
that's
talking
super
about the
exciting.
flying open and
Exactly.
missing up. Yeah.
Right. It's like, yeah, misdirection, getting that involved. I'm really excited to look into that. I am still excited to like look into things like the forces that we were seeing in the ANOVA of the previous
Yeah.
study. We didn't look too much into forces here because it was once you start talking about forces and energetics at positions,
Hmm.
it gets a little bit murkier in terms of application. We wanted to make this, it already wasn't easy to apply, right, with what we found, but we wanted to make it as easy as possible, be able to tie all of these positions back to certain points in the throw. But getting able to put in energetics and forces in there and see what that might do, maybe even the full time series analysis
Hmm.
and not break this down by your four key points
Yeah.
is something I want to look into too. But the sky's the limit here. This is just the first step, but it's a good first step, significant one still.
Future's bright.
That's right.
Let's go.
Sweet.